You think you already know how this story ends, but what if the version you've been fed is only half the truth? Because right now, something strange is happening around the King Von case. Not rumors, not recycled blog posts, I'm talking about details resurfacing, paperwork moving, and conversations behind the scenes that people in the industry are suddenly not so quiet about anymore. And here's the part nobody's saying out loud: when new files start getting attention years later, it's usually not random. It means somebody wants something seen. Or somebody slipped. Think about that. We're talking about a night that already changed the energy of drill music forever. A moment that froze one of the most controversial, storytelling-driven rappers at the peak of his rise. But now, pieces of that night, timelines, reactions, who knew what and who moved how are being looked at differently. And it doesn't just affect one name. It touches affiliations, loyalty, street politics, even the way certain artists have moved since that night. Because when the narrative shifts, even slightly, it forces people to ask questions they weren't asking before. Why did certain people go silent? Why did others suddenly get louder? And why are fans now connecting dots that didn't seem connected? Back then, here's where it gets deeper. This isn't just about what happened, it's about what's being revealed now. And who benefits from it. Because in rap, timing is never accidental. So before you lock in your opinion, before you say, "We've heard this already," you might want to listen closely, because what's coming out next doesn't just revisit the past. It might actually change how you see the whole situation. You've probably heard the story 100 times already. Late night, outside an Atlanta lounge, chaos breaks out, shots fired, and within moments, King Von is gone. That version spread fast, almost too fast. Headlines locked in a narrative before most people could even process what really happened. But here's the thing, people don't usually stop to question. When a story moves that quickly, who's controlling? How it's told? Because if you go back and really look at the details from that night in November 2020, things don't feel as simple as they were presented. The incident outside Monaco Hookah Lounge wasn't just a random altercation that spiraled out of control. There were multiple layers, different crews, rising tensions, and a level of anticipation that suggests something was already brewing before the first punch was thrown. Now focus on the timing. Within hours, names were already circulating. Quando. Rondo was immediately pulled into the spotlight, and not long after, Lil Tim became the central figure tied to the shooting itself. That narrative stuck. It was clean, direct, and easy for the public to digest. But real situations, especially ones involving artists with complicated street ties, are rarely that straightforward. Witness accounts didn't all line up perfectly. Some described a quick escalation, others hinted at a situation that felt like it was seconds away from exploding long before it actually did. And then there's the question of movement. Who arrived when? Who positioned themselves where? And who reacted first? These are the kind of details that don't always make it into viral clips or trending posts, but they matter more than anything else when you're trying to understand the full picture. And here's where things start to shift over time. As more footage surfaced and conversations quietly happened behind closed doors, people began re-examining those first assumptions. Not publicly, not loudly, but enough to create doubt. Because when you slow everything down, frame by frame, moment by moment, you start to notice how fast everything unfolded, and how many people were involved in ways that weren't initially discussed. It also raises another uncomfortable question. Was this truly spontaneous, or was it a collision that had been building for longer than we realized? In the world these artists come from, tension doesn't just appear overnight. It stacks. Small moments, online exchanges, affiliations, loyalty lines, all of it builds pressure. And when that pressure finally releases, it looks sudden to the outside world, even if it wasn't sudden at all. After that night, the ripple effects were immediate. Fans picked sides, artists moved differently, some became more vocal, others noticeably stepped back, and the silence in certain areas, that spoke just as loudly as anything posted online. Because when people who are usually quick to react suddenly go quiet, it's rarely by accident. Meanwhile, the official narrative stayed mostly unchanged. The legal framing, the public explanation, it all pointed in one direction. Case closed, at least on the surface. But stories like this don't really close. They linger, they evolve, and sometimes, years later, they reopen in ways nobody expected. What's happening now is part of that evolution. Details that once felt locked in are being looked at again, not necessarily because something was proven wrong, but because people are asking better questions. Questions about positioning, intent, and reaction. Time. Questions about who had awareness in those final moments, and who didn't. And when those questions start gaining traction, even quietly, they create something powerful: uncertainty. Because once uncertainty enters the story, the original narrative doesn't feel as solid anymore. And in a case this high profile, even a small crack in the story can change how everything is perceived. That's why this moment matters. Not because it rewrites history completely, but because it challenges the idea that we ever had the full story to begin with. What makes this situation even more complicated isn't just what happened that night, it's everything that followed and how quickly the story was packaged for the public. Within days, people weren't just talking about the loss of King Von, they were debating guilt, loyalty, and retaliation like the entire situation had already been fully understood. But when you step back and examine how narratives form in moments like this, you start to notice a pattern. Speed often replaces accuracy, because while the spotlight stayed fixed on Quando Rondo and Lul Tim, there were other elements quietly fading into the background. Surveillance angles that didn't go viral, witness statements that never became headlines, subtle inconsistencies in how different accounts described the same sequence of events. These aren't things that trend, but they're exactly the kind of details that can shift understanding over time. And here's where things start to feel uncomfortable. In high-profile cases tied to music and street culture, there's always a tension between what's legally established and what's socially believed. The legal side focuses on evidence, self-defense claims, and procedural outcomes. The public side, especially in hip-hop, often runs on perception, reputation, and emotion. When those two versions don't fully align, the gap between them becomes a breeding ground for speculation. That gap is still there. Some people accepted the official explanation immediately. Others questioned it but didn't push too hard. And then there's a third group, the ones who kept watching quietly, waiting for more information to surface. Those are the people now paying attention again, because the conversation is shifting in subtle ways. Look at how people close to the situation have moved since then. Not just what they've said, but what they've avoided saying. In a culture where artists often respond instantly, through music, social media, or interviews, silence can carry meaning. It can signal caution, legal awareness, or simply the understanding that speaking too much could reopen something that was meant to stay settled. At the same time, others have done the opposite. They've leaned into the narrative, reinforcing certain versions of events, sometimes indirectly, sometimes through lyrics or coded messages. That contrast, silence on one side, emphasis on the other, creates a strange imbalance. It makes you wonder whether everyone is reacting to the same reality or to different versions of it. And then there's the footage. Not just the clips that circulated early on, but the extended angles, slowed down sequences, and reanalyzed breakdowns that have surfaced over time. When people revisit those visuals with fresh eyes, they're not just watching for shock value, they're looking for clarity. Who moved first? Who hesitated? Who seemed aware of what was about to happen? And who looked caught off guard? These questions don't always have clear answers, but the act of asking them changes how the event is understood. It shifts the focus from a single moment to a chain of moments. And in that chain, even small differences in timing can completely. Right now, what you're seeing isn't a loud, explosive shift. It's quieter than that. More calculated, conversations happening in smaller circles, analysis replacing assumptions, people revisiting details they once ignored. That kind of shift doesn't happen by accident. It usually means one thing. The story isn't done being told. What really changes everything isn't just revisiting the night itself. It's realizing how much of the aftermath shaped the version of events people accepted as truth. When King Von passed, the focus immediately turned to grief, shock, and reaction. But beneath that surface, there was a second story forming in real time. One built on influence, timing, and control over the narrative. And once a narrative locks in, especially at that level, it becomes incredibly difficult to challenge, even if new perspectives begin to emerge later. Think about how quickly lines were drawn. Fans aligned themselves emotionally, artists moved strategically, and the industry as a whole seemed to settle into a version of the story that felt complete. But complete doesn't always mean accurate. It often just means widely accepted. And when acceptance comes before full understanding, important details can get buried under repetition. Now consider how the names connected to that night have carried the weight of it ever since. Quando Rondo didn't just become part of a headline, his entire public perception shifted almost overnight. Every move, every appearance, every release started being filtered through that moment. The same goes for Lul Tim, whose name became permanently tied to a single action, regardless of the broader context surrounding it. That's what high-profile incidents do. They compress complex situations into simplified identities. But here's where the shift gets deeper. As time passes, distance creates space for reevaluation. People who were once reacting emotionally begin to analyze more critically. Footage gets rewatched, statements get reinterpreted, and patterns that weren't obvious before start to stand out. And in this case, one of the biggest patterns people are noticing is how controlled the early narrative felt, how quickly it formed, how firmly it held, and how little room there was for alternative interpretations. That kind of control doesn't necessarily mean manipulation, but it does suggest influence. Because in moments like this, multiple forces are at play. Media outlets trying to report quickly, fans amplifying what they see, and individuals connected to the situation managing what they say and when they say it. All of those elements combine to shape the story long before it settles into something closer to the truth. Another factor that's starting to get more attention is the environment leading up to that night. Not just the immediate moments outside, the venue, but the broader context, tensions, reputations, and the unspoken dynamics that exist between different circles in the rap world. These aren't things that show up clearly in reports or headlines, but they influence behavior in ways that are impossible to ignore once you start looking for them. Because when people talk about whether something was spontaneous or inevitable, they're really asking a deeper question. Was this an isolated incident, or the result of a buildup that finally reached its breaking point? That question doesn't have a simple answer, but it changes how everything is viewed. If it was truly spontaneous, then the focus stays on reaction and self-defense. If it was part of a larger buildup, then attention shifts to awareness, anticipation, and whether certain outcomes were more predictable than they seemed. And that's where the current conversation is heading, not toward rewriting history completely, but toward expanding it, adding layers that were either overlooked or intentionally left out. People are no longer satisfied with just knowing what happened. They want to understand why it happened the way it did, and whether it could have unfolded differently under slightly different circumstances. At the same time, there's a growing awareness that some questions may never have clear answers. In the situations involving multiple perspectives, conflicting accounts, and high emotional stakes, absolute clarity is rare. But even without definitive answers, the process of questioning still matters. It keeps the story from becoming static, from being reduced to a single version that no longer gets examined. What's unfolding now is less about new evidence appearing out of nowhere and more about existing information being seen through a different lens. And that shift in perspective can be just as powerful as any new detail because it changes how everything connects. In the end, the biggest impact of all this isn't just on how people view that night, it's on how they approach similar stories moving forward. There's a growing recognition that the first version of events isn't always the final one, and that understanding takes time, patience, and a willingness to look beyond what's immediately presented. And once that mindset takes hold, it doesn't just change one story, it changes how every story like this is told, heard, and remembered. What's becoming harder to ignore now is how the long-term impact of that night has unfolded in ways nobody fully predicted. The loss of King Von didn't just leave a gap in music, it reshaped how artists move, how conflicts are perceived, and how quickly situations can escalate when pressure has been building beneath the surface. But beyond the emotional weight and industry reactions, there's a quieter shift happening, one that focuses less on what was said publicly and more on what's been unfolding quietly over time. Because if you track the timeline after the incident, you start to notice something unusual. The intensity of the conversation didn't disappear, it just changed form. Early on, everything was loud, immediate, and reactive. Social media was flooded, opinions were sharp, and narratives were forming by the hour. But as weeks turned into months, that noise settled into something more controlled. Discussions became selective, details stopped evolving publicly, and for a while, it felt like the story had reached its final version. But stories like this rarely stay still. Over time, attention shifted back, not all at once, but in waves. A clip resurfacing here, a breakdown gaining traction there, a quiet conversation sparking new questions somewhere else. None of it seemed big enough individually to restart the entire discussion, but together it created momentum, and that momentum is what's driving the current re-examination. At the center of that re-examination are the same key names, but viewed through a different lens. Quando Rondo is no longer just seen in the immediate context of that night. People are looking at his movements before and after, trying to understand the broader picture. The same applies to Lil Tim, whose role has been discussed repeatedly, but is now being analyzed with more attention to detail rather than quick conclusions. And that shift from reaction to analysis is where everything changes, because analysis doesn't rely on emotion the same way initial reactions do. It slows things down, it questions assumptions, it looks for patterns instead of moments. And when people begin to approach a situation like this analytically, they start noticing how many elements were simplified in the original narrative. One of the most significant elements being revisited is the idea of inevitability. Was this something that could have been avoided, or was it always heading toward that outcome? That question is driving a lot of the current conversation because it forces people to think beyond the visible moment and consider everything leading up to it. Another detail gaining attention is how quickly certain interpretations became dominant. In fast-moving situations, the first widely accepted explanation often becomes the foundation for everything that follows. But if that foundation is incomplete, even slightly, then every conclusion built on top of it becomes less stable. That doesn't mean it collapses entirely, it just means it needs to be re-examined more carefully. And that's exactly what's happening now. People are revisiting footage, but not just to watch, they're studying it, they're comparing angles, timing movements, and asking questions that weren't part of the initial conversation. They're also re-evaluating statements, not necessarily looking for contradictions, but for context that may have been overlooked the first time. At the same time, there's a growing awareness of how much influence perception has in shaping reality within the music world. Once a narrative takes hold, it doesn't just inform public opinion, it affects how artists are treated, how alliances are formed, and how future situations are interpreted. That kind of influence makes it even more important to understand where that narrative came from and how it developed. And then there's the role of silence again, something that continues to stand out the more people pay attention. In an environment where visibility is constant and reactions are expected, the decision not to speak can carry just as much weight as anything said out loud. It can signal caution, strategy, or simply the understanding that some things are better left unaddressed publicly. All of this creates a situation where the story isn't being rewritten, but it is being expanded in ways that make it feel different from how it was first understood. The core events remain the same, but the interpretation of those events is becoming more layered, more complex, and in some ways more uncertain, and that uncertainty is what keeps the conversation alive. Because as long as there are unanswered questions, as long as there are details that don't fully align, people will keep looking for clarity, even if that clarity never fully arrives. What matters now isn't just what happened, but how it's being understood today. And that understanding is still evolving, shaped by new perspectives, deeper analysis, and a willingness to question what once seemed settled. If you've made it this far, then you already know this isn't just another retelling of what happened. To King Von, this is about looking beyond the surface and questioning everything that was handed to us from day one. Because the truth is, stories like this don't stay frozen in time. They evolve, they shift, and sometimes they reveal things only to the people paying close attention. So now the question is simple. What do you think really happened? Was it exactly how it was first reported? Or are there details that still don't sit right with you? Drop your thoughts below, but don't just repeat what everyone else is saying. I want to hear what you noticed. The small details, the moments that didn't add up, the things people usually ignore. Because those are the pieces that actually move conversations forward. And if you're someone who wants more content like this, real breakdowns, deeper analysis, and stories that don't just follow the obvious narrative, then make sure you hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Not because it sounds good to say, but because the next drop might connect dots you didn't even realize were connected. Also, share this with someone who thinks they already know the full story. Let's see if their perspective changes after this, because at the end of the day, this isn't just about one night, it's about understanding how narratives are built, how they spread, and how they can change when people start asking the right questions. Stay sharp, stay curious, and don't take everything at face value.